Okay, picture this. It's the year 1550. You're looking at a map of the world, and somebody points to this tiny, wet, kind of forgotten island on the edge of Europe and says, that place, it's going to rule the world one day. You would have thought they were completely nuts. So let's get into it, because the story of the British Empire is honestly one of the strangest and most unlikely tales in all of history. I mean, you've got these two totally different pictures of England. On one side, you have the 1550 version, no money, on the fringe of everything important, no real army, and just completely terrified of the day's real superpower, which was Spain. Then you hit fast forward a few hundred years, and somehow that same little island is running an empire that covers a quarter of the entire globe. The switch is just mind-boggling. So that's the big question we're going to tackle. How on earth does the perpetual underdog, this footnote on the world's map, somehow manage to flip the entire script and end up running the whole show? Right, so the story you probably think you know, the one with the noble kings and queens, glorious battles, and some kind of manifest destiny, you can just go ahead and forget all of that. The real story is so much messier, way more interesting, and believe it or not, a lot more modern than you'd think. It's a story about government-sponsored crime, a revolutionary new business idea, and the simple, desperate need to pay the bills. This whole unbelievable story kicks off with England basically backed into a corner. They were desperate, they were broke, they were outgunned. So the Queen had to make a deal. Not with the devil exactly, but maybe the next best thing. Pirates. To really get this, you have to put yourself in Queen Elizabeth I's shoes in the late 1500s. Spain was the king of the world. They were literally pulling mountains of silver and gold out of the Americas. Elizabeth, meanwhile, is back in London staring at a completely empty treasury. She can't afford a navy to go toe-to-toe with Spain. She needed a plan B, and she needed it fast. And that plan B had a very official-sounding name, privateering. But let's be real about what that meant. It was state-sponsored piracy. The government was handing out official licenses to go be a pirate. This is where guys like Sir Francis Drake come onto the scene. To the English, he was this dashing hero, a brilliant sailor. But if you were Spanish and it was your ship he was looting, he was a terrorist. Simple as that. The deal Elizabeth offered these men was just a masterclass in plausible deniability. It basically went like this. You guys take all the risk. Go attack our enemies' treasure ships. If you get caught and executed, we have no idea who you are. But if you make it back home with the loot, the crown gets a huge chunk of it. An incredible gamble with an immense reward. And the success of this plan was just staggering. On just one single voyage around the world, Francis Drake came back with so much treasure that the Queen's cut alone was enough to pay off England's entire national debt. Not only that, it funded the entire government for the next 2 years. I mean, just think about that. It's like one successful mission completely wiping out a modern country's deficit. It was crime, but on an industrial, nation-saving scale. But here's the thing. As great as it was, hijacking treasure ships isn't exactly a long-term business plan. The English quickly figured out that if they wanted real, lasting wealth and power, they couldn't just steal stuff. They needed to control trade. They needed to get their hands on the most valuable things on the planet. And at that time, that meant spices, specifically things like nutmeg, which was literally worth more than its weight in gold. And this desperate quest for spice was about to create what might just be the most powerful and dangerous invention in human history, the modern corporation. So, back in the year 1600, a group of merchants had a big problem. A single trip to the East Indies to buy spices was insanely expensive. And it was ridiculously risky. Your ship could sink in a storm, pirates could get you. No one person could afford to bet their entire fortune on one trip. So they came up with this game-changing idea. They'd pool their money together and split the risk. They sold shares in the voyage. They created what's called a joint stock company. You might know it by its more famous name, the East India Company. And this right here is the most important point, the one that most people get completely wrong. When we think about the conquest of India, we imagine the British army, the redcoats, marching for king and country. But that is not what happened, at least not for the first 2.5 centuries. The British government didn't conquer India. A private, for-profit corporation did. This quote just nails how bizarre and totally new the East India Company was. To understand it, you have to think of it like this. It wasn't a country. It was like Google, but with its own army. It was like Amazon, but with the power to declare war. This company could mint its own money, sign treaties, and, this is the crazy part, raise its own massive private army. Its decisions weren't based on diplomacy. They were based on the quarterly earnings report. And the company had this very clear, very cold-blooded, step-by-step playbook. It started small, build a few warehouses on the coast, be friendly with the local Indian rulers. But then, as the Mughal Empire in India started to weaken and splinter, the company saw its chance. The accountants back in London did the math and realized, hey, it's actually cheaper to conquer the local population than to keep paying them a fair price for their goods. Profit, not politics, was the engine of conquest. This corporate playbook all builds up to one single pivotal moment, one battle where the company's ambition finally tips over into straight-up conquest. This is the story of one of the most famous hostile takeovers in all of history. At the center of this story is a guy named Robert Clive. He shows up in India as just another low-level clerk for the company. So miserable, in fact, that he reportedly tried to take his own life. But it turns out he had an absolute genius for manipulation and a completely ruthless ambition that would take him from being a nobody to a military commander and eventually the richest self-made man in all of Europe. So in 1757, Clive and his corporate army find themselves up against the massive army of the Nawab of Bengal. And just look at these numbers. Clive has 3,000 soldiers. The Nawab has over 50,000. That's more than a 10-to-1 disadvantage. On paper, this isn't even a battle. It should have been an absolute slaughter. Winning a fair fight was completely out of the question. But Clive had absolutely no intention of fighting a fair fight. He knew the company's greatest asset wasn't its firepower, it was its willingness to be deceitful. So the night before this huge battle, he wasn't planning military strategy. He was busy writing letters. He had secretly gotten in touch with the Nawab's most powerful general, a man named Mir Jafar, and he made him an offer that was as simple as it was treacherous. Betray your boss. Tell your men to stand down tomorrow, let our tiny little army win, and in return, we, the company, will make you the new ruler. A puppet, of course, but a ruler nonetheless. And it worked perfectly. When the battle started the next day, a massive chunk of the Nawab's army, under Mir Jafar's command, literally just stood there and watched. The battle was over in a few hours. The East India Company had just acquired the richest province in all of India through bribery and betrayal. It was a hostile takeover in every sense of the word. And for the people of Bengal, the consequences of this corporate rule were an absolute catastrophe. The company became the government, they looted the local treasury, they cranked up taxes even while a horrible famine was raging, and they forced farmers to stop growing food like rice and start growing opium that could be sold for a profit in China. Millions of people starved to death. And back in London, the company's stock price went through the roof. Eventually, this corporate monster that England had created became too big, too powerful, and too embarrassing for even the British government to ignore. And that's what leads us to the final, most famous phase of the British Empire. In 1857, after about 100 years of corporate abuse and exploitation, India just erupted in this massive rebellion. The British government was forced to finally step in. They basically dissolved the East India Company and took direct control over India. Queen Victoria was named the Empress of India, and the era we all recognize from movies, the High Empire, had officially begun. From that point on, the empire expanded at an incredible speed. Using all the new tools of the Industrial Revolution, things like steamships, the telegraph, machine guns, Britain just carved up huge pieces of Africa and Asia. But as you can see from this timeline, the peak didn't last very long. And ironically, the very thing that started the whole empire, money, was also what brought it down. After 2 devastating world wars, Britain was bankrupt, and they simply couldn't afford to hold on to their colonies anymore. Now, you'll often hear defenders of the empire talk about all the good things they left behind, right? They'll say, we brought civilization, we brought laws, we built railways. And look, it's true. They did build an incredible railway system. But you have to look closely at the map. Those tracks weren't built to connect villages to cities to help the local people. They were built for one reason, to connect the inland mines and plantations directly to the coastal ports. It was a giant conveyor belt designed to get resources out of the country and back to Britain as efficiently as possible. So today, the political empire is gone. The red has been wiped off the map. But its influence, its software, is still running all over the world. The English language, legal systems based on common law, the world's shipping lanes, global financial hubs like London. In a lot of ways, we're all still living inside the global operating system that Britain installed centuries ago. And this really brings us to the most important takeaway. The East India Company officially died in the 1800s. But the model it created, this idea of a private, multinational corporation that acts with the power of a government, that has more wealth than many countries, and that shapes our lives in ways we don't even realize, that model is more alive and more powerful today than it ever was. That's the real, lasting legacy of this whole crazy story. The story of the British Empire shows you don't actually have to be the biggest or the strongest to take over the world. Sometimes you just have to be more organized and more ruthless. But it's also a powerful reminder that no matter how powerful you are, no matter how much of the map you paint your color, eventually all empires fall. Which kind of leaves us with one last question to chew on. What empires, corporate or otherwise, are we living in today?